All right. So now I move into the section on cultural crisis. Now, this term, the text talked about being the end of century, and they used the French word, which I think is pronounced fin de siècle. I already knew I did that wrong. Here's what's really funny, just as a quick side note. Um, okay, I just don't understand, and I have not understood. I mean, this has been like my big question since I was a student at Modesto Junior College until now. If you put an Arabic word or a Hebrew word or a Japanese word or some other language, they will often give you a phonetic spelling to get to say it properly. And for some reason, even though the French we all know is not really a phonetic language, that I mean, Descartes is spelled Descartes. Okay, you wouldn't know it's Descartes by just seeing it. And so they put these French terms that we're supposed to, that it's assumed that we're gonna say right, and then we tear it up, and then we disrespect the French language and make ourselves look silly. I've seen many times people give very intelligent discourse on reading a text from a French author, um, or use a French term, and they say the name so wrong that it distracts you, but then you're laughing like, well, unless you hear it a lot, you're gonna not get it right. So it's very strange to me. Why don't they just put a phonetic, you know, in parentheses so you know how to say it right if you're gonna put it there after all, right? So whatever. I just thought I would throw in that 2 cents on that. Okay. Um, in any case, by the way, in the past, I think there was a lot more people that knew French and being intellectual. A lot of people knew French and German, and now, less and less. That's not always the case. Anyhow, moving on. So, um, this section we're talking about an end of the century, the idea that things weren't so optimistic. So we've kind of talked about this off and on about there's that positivist side. There was the optimist aspect of things, and then they're seeing the increased drug use and alcohol use and so on, and then reflected in the novels and in popular literature and by writers. And this goes back to what I was saying when I said there. I don't necessarily believe there was the good old days, so to speak. And you know, I wonder. Um, I wonder if the fact that literacy becomes more and more commonplace, that we get to see that so many different groups of society, as long as you're at least literate and having access to writing, which still usually puts you on top of things a little bit more than some other groups of people, are going to be able to say a lot more of their thoughts and experiences from resulting in whatever current system is taking place. And so the contradictions come out more, right? So, we have LA, there's Compton, and then there's Beverly Hills. That's both LA. And those are two different experiences of LA, right? I mean, it's just one example. There's California, there's the agricultural sector, there's Bakersfield, and then there's Sonora, and then there's San Francisco. Again, very different experience of California. So writers and various people can put out their experiences or their sense of what's taking place. And so you see these. I mean, in a sense, it's interesting, this use of drugs and the way the increase was taking place with even in the middle class. Don't you kind of maybe see potentially that taking place with pharmaceuticals now? I mean, illegal drugs are demonized, but legal drugs, as a way to deal with our problems, are made very legitimate. Now, I don't want to completely just attack pharmaceutical industries. They save lives. I had antibiotics, as I was mentioning earlier, and that helped me out tremendously. And some people suffer from real depression that really can be fixed by the use of those things. But I'm just saying that there is I mean, I think we all are, we make jokes about the endless commercials about the next drug in which they tell you, oh, by the way, blood may come out your bottom, and, if you want to commit suicide, call 911 immediately. This is going to help you stop smoking because we're going to try to help you be healthier. Okay, So, and you do see a kind of increased cynicism about that, while at the same time an increase of the use. And I think that our own movies and TV and authors kind of critique our modernity now. But you see this birth of modernism and basically addressing a lot of their own concerns. Now, Friedrich Nietzsche. Nietzsche is an interesting character. He gets dropped in here kind of awkwardly, and he deserves a whole nother topic. A whole nother section, should I say. Yes, he is kind of seen as one of those major critics of society then. And his legacy is very interesting and complex. And first of all, he was not a philosopher. He was a classicist he wrote ideas that get incorporated into philosophy. And he said controversial things. He came out of a religious tradition, but, he said God is dead and we have killed him. That's what he's known for, very controversially. But he's almost more or less critiquing what he sees to be hypocrisy in Christianity, in the way that society deals with ethics and morality. He's not as straightforward as you would think, and his writings are not as coherent or consistent. He is someone who I feel kind of really comes out of a romantic tradition, and he's at the same time critiquing society. He was controversial from day one. He totally loathed socialists and anarchists, but they loved him from the beginning, the earlier ones. His sister ends up taking over, his work and editorializing his work, and she pawns him off as a Nazi. The Nazis are going to officially use him as like the philosopher of the Nazi regime, almost in the way that the Soviet Union propped up Karl Marx. And it took a long time before Nietzsche could be actually removed from the Nazi legacy and now seen as a philosopher in his own right, a thinker in his own right, that was not associated with that. And you can like him or not like him or critique him however you want to, but outside of that. But I mean, his writings were so controversial, he was even blamed for World War I by some people in Britain. Like I said, I can't say enough how interesting his legacy is. And you can watch more about him on a BBC Human All Too Human episodes if you want to look that up on YouTube, if it's still there. Okay, moving on. Here's an example of one just painting of Degas. As you saw in the textbook, this is kind of looking at, it says everything that you need to say about her condition and drinking, and at the same time it's kind of tragic and romantic. It's kind of like almost like the punk music scene or something, right, where it celebrates. There's that kind of like the yuckiness, but yet at the same time it's kind of also like celebrated in some way. But I'm just going to move on from there. Okay, so then this is an interesting section, especially with what's just been taking place now with the Supreme Court and the issue of gay marriage. In the middle of all this, we're seeing the tightening of gender boundaries and a heightened fear of homosexuality, which is a term that's just coined around this time period, if you notice that, okay? And you're seeing sexuality. I mean, it's so strange, these fluctuations about what's being accepted and then what's not being accepted, where things are actually like closing in on human behavior and are being more liberal. It's not consistent and not in the way you would expect. So first of all, there is no word, let's say, in the Bible for homosexuality. My understanding is that in ancient Greek, there's not really a word for that. There's words that depict behavior between males. Now, in English, the common word was sodomite. Sodomy was often used, but it also usually ended up applying at times, I think, to even heterosexual acts that were not considered natural. In other words, oral sex or anal or something like that. Now, um, even in the Bible, just as a side note, the Sodom and Gomorrah is where the term sodomy comes from, and the men of Sodom and Gomorrah came for Lot's guests, who were actually angels, and they wanted to have sex with them, and that's where the term comes up. Now, that's in Genesis 19. I would just offer you to then read the book of Judges, chapter 19 as well. And you see the same theme happen where the men, the tribe of Benjamin, then want to come rape a male guest, and then they end up taking his concubine instead. There's a theme here that is not necessarily homosexual, and there's something more sinister. And even Jesus, when he talked about in the New Testament, he tells people to go preach, and if the town doesn't listen, I tell you, it'll be greater for Sodom and Gomorrah than for that town on that day. There seems to be an issue of hospitality or some other issue other than sexuality, and early Christian writers had kind of inconsistent views on this in the earlier centuries. And so the approach to sexuality and homosexuality, I'm just trying to say, is not been consistent. I would say what's been consistent is that traditionally, societies have seen males and females to make kids, and the quote unquote traditional marriage to be what they accept. But what people were doing on the side in the middle of being married, and what men were doing with men, and were you the receiver or the received, changes a whole lot of other things that make the issue of whether the sexual act is really the issue or the actual control of family life is what I'm trying to say. And I'm not really debating with anybody on your values right now. I'm just talking about looking at the consistency of these matters, okay, and the way that they've panned out historically. I think that if you just look in the text and you're seeing, the approach to sexuality, then it's interesting to think about where it's at now. That's all left I'm going to just say for this section. And forgive me if I didn't do this section justice, but go ahead and read that. Klimt, he's mainly famous for his painting of the kiss. A very sensual artist. And I happen to like his work. In a certain sense, he's almost become like cliche, like many great artists where, they get their one famous painting or picture and you can buy them at Target or something, and the actual meaning behind the background is lost. It's kind of like Van Gogh is the same thing, or, Da Vinci or something. But in any case, I'm going to move on from there. Actually, I'll return to this section in the next lecture.